The Valoran rescue cruiser Bright Horizon hung in orbit above the ice planet. Inside the medical bay, Kevin lay on a treatment bed while advanced healing technology worked on his damaged hands. The Valoran doctors had never seen frostbite this severe on a living patient. Most beings who suffered such injuries did not survive long enough for treatment. Vera sat beside him with her own, bandages wrapped around minor wounds. She had refused to leave Kevin's side since they came aboard. The bond forged in survival was not something either of them would forget easily. In the next room, the 3 Valoran crew members were recovering from their cold exposure. Their exoskeletons were being repaired with specialized compounds. Oreth had needed emergency treatment for the cracks that had formed during those first terrible hours. But all 3 would make full recoveries. Commander Dyes finished giving their official report to Admiral Dross, the captain of the rescue ship. The Admiral was an older Valoran with gray coloring on their shell, and the slow, careful movements of someone who had seen much in their long life. Dross listened to the entire story without interruption. When Dyes finished, the Admiral was quiet for a long moment. They finally asked if Dyes was certain about the details. The commander was describing a human who had built a shelter from frozen water and saved 3 Valorans from an environment that should have killed everyone. Dyes said they were completely certain. They had lived through it. The human Kevin Cole had turned the deadliest element on that planet into their salvation. It was not magic or advanced technology. It was knowledge that humans had carried with them for thousands of years. Admiral Dross called for scientist Kell to join them. When Kell arrived, the Admiral asked to see their recordings and data from the incident. Kell produced their device and played back everything they had documented. The construction of the shelter, the temperature readings, the survival techniques explained in Kevin's own words. The Admiral watched it all with growing amazement. When the recordings finished, they turned to Kell and asked what conclusions the scientist had drawn from their observations. Kell spoke carefully, but with clear conviction. They said that humans possessed survival knowledge that no other species in the Galactic Council had developed. This was not because humans were more intelligent or more advanced. It was because human history had forced them to adapt to impossible conditions over and over again. They had learned lessons that the galaxy had forgotten or never knew in the first place. Admiral Dross asked what Kell recommended doing with this information. Kell said it should be shared. Every species in the Council could benefit from human survival techniques, not just for ice worlds, but for all extreme environments. Humans had conquered deserts and oceans and jungles and mountains. They had learned to survive everywhere. That knowledge should not remain locked away on one world. The Admiral considered this for a long time. Then they asked to speak with Kevin Cole directly. In the medical bay, Kevin looked up as Admiral Dross entered. The Valoran leader stood at the foot of his bed and studied him with ancient eyes. Kevin had no idea what rank or importance this being held, but he sensed it was significant. Dross spoke formally. They said they had reviewed Commander Tice's report and scientist Kell's data. They had come to express gratitude on behalf of the Valoran people. 3 of their citizens were alive because of Kevin's actions. Kevin said he had done what anyone would do. He had helped people who needed help. The Admiral made a clicking sound that Kevin did not recognize. Dross said that was not true. Most beings would have focused on their own survival. Most beings would not have known how to help even if they wanted to. Kevin possessed both the knowledge and the willingness to sacrifice for strangers. That combination was rare in the galaxy. Kevin did not know how to respond to such praise, so he simply thanked the Admiral. Dross continued. They said the Galactic Council had debated human membership for many years. Some species still believed humans were too young and too primitive to contribute meaningfully to galactic civilization. What happened on that ice world proved those doubters wrong. Kevin asked what the Admiral meant. Dross explained that humans were not primitive. They were specialized in something no other species had mastered. They were survival experts. They had evolved on a world that tried to kill them in 1,000 different ways, and they had not only survived, but thrived. That ability was valuable beyond measure. The Admiral then told Kevin about a proposal they intended to make to the Council. A new training academy where human instructors would teach survival techniques to representatives from every species. The knowledge Kevin's grandfather had passed down to him could be passed down to the entire galaxy. Kevin felt something stir in his chest. Pride, maybe. Or hope. He asked if the Admiral was serious. Dross said they were completely serious. The galaxy faced many dangers. Climate disasters. Ship crashes on hostile worlds. Exploration missions gone wrong. In all these situations, the knowledge humans carried could save countless lives. It would be wasteful to let such knowledge remain with only one species. In the recovery room next door, Orith heard the conversation through the open door. The medic got up slowly and walked to where the Admiral and Kevin were talking. They stood beside Kevin's bed and placed their clawed hand on his shoulder. Orith spoke with emotion in their voice. They said that Kevin had carried them through a frozen wasteland. He had built them a shelter from snow and dug them out of a collapsed tomb with his bare hands. He had damaged his own body to keep them alive. This was not the behavior of a primitive species. This was the behavior of heroes. Commander Dizes and Kel arrived behind Orith. All three Valorans stood together looking at the human who had saved them. Dizes said they had learned something important on that ice world. They had learned that technology alone was not enough. Sometimes you needed knowledge that could not be programmed into a computer. Sometimes you needed the stubborn refusal to die that only came from generations of struggling against impossible odds. Humans had both. The Admiral looked at the four survivors standing together. Two species from worlds that could not be more different. United by shared hardship and mutual respect. Dross said this was what the Galactic Council was supposed to be. Not just an alliance of convenience, but a true partnership where each species contributed what they did best. The Valorans brought technology and ancient wisdom. The humans brought adaptability and the will to survive anything. 3 months later, Kevin stood in front of a classroom on Valora Prime. The desert heat was brutal, but the building was cooled to comfortable temperatures. 40 students from a dozen different species sat before him. Insectoids and reptilians and aquatics and beings he had no names for. All of them were here to learn. Kevin held up a handful of white powder. He explained that this was artificial snow. On many worlds, it represented death. But today, they were going to learn how to make it into shelter, into survival, into hope. He began his lesson. He taught them the techniques his grandfather had taught him. The same techniques that had saved 5 lives on an ice world called KR7. The students listened and asked questions and practiced. With their own hands, when the class was over, Kel approached. Kevin, the scientist, had become a regular visitor to the academy. They said they were proud of what Kevin was building here. Kevin looked out at his students as they filed out of the room. He said he was just passing along what others had given him. That was how knowledge survived. You taught it to someone else, and they taught it to someone else, and it kept going forever. Kel asked if Kevin ever thought about the ice world, about those terrible hours in the cold. Kevin smiled and said he thought about it every day, not with fear or regret, with gratitude. That frozen planet had shown him what humans could really do. It had shown the galaxy too. Outside the window of the academy, the Valoran sun blazed down on a desert world that had never known cold. But inside, Kevin was teaching 40 students how to survive the worst winter imaginable. His grandfather would have been proud. 6 hours passed inside the buried shelter. 6 hours of digging and resting and digging again. The work was exhausting and painful. Kevin's hands had gone from raw to numb to something beyond feeling. Vera's face was pale with fatigue, but she never stopped working. The Valorans did what they could to help. Kel used their scientific instruments to measure the density of the packed snow and identify the weakest points to dig through. Orith tended to the humans' injuries between shifts and made sure everyone stayed hydrated. Commander Thizes kept morale up by talking and asking questions and reminding everyone that rescue would come eventually. During one of the rest periods, Thizes asked Kevin a question that had clearly been on their mind for some time. They wanted to know why Kevin was doing this. Why he was destroying his hands and pushing himself to exhaustion for 3 aliens he barely knew. Kevin thought about the question while he flexed his bandaged fingers. He told Thizes that on Earth, there was a code among people who lived in harsh places. You helped others because someday you might need help yourself. You shared your warmth because cold was everyone's enemy. You did not ask what species someone was or where they came from. You just did what needed to be done. Thizes said that Valorans did not have such traditions. Their desert world had taught them to compete for limited resources. Water was precious. Shade was precious. Sharing meant having less for yourself. Kevin nodded and said he understood. Different worlds created different peoples. But humans had learned something important during their ice ages. He explained that when the cold came, individuals died alone, but groups survived together. Sharing was not weakness on a frozen world. Sharing was the only way to stay alive. Vera paused her digging and added her own thoughts. She said that was why humans had spread so far across Earth, despite not being the strongest or fastest animals. They looked out for each other. A human alone was vulnerable, but a human in a group was unstoppable. Orith asked if humans ever abandoned each other. Surely some humans must leave others behind when survival was at stake. Kevin admitted that yes, some humans did terrible things. But he said those were the exceptions, not the rule. Most humans would risk their own lives to save a stranger. It was built into how they thought. It was part of what made them human. The conversation was interrupted by Vera making a sound of excitement. She had broken through to something that was not snow. Her fingers found the edge of the metal debris that blocked their exit. If they could move it or dig around it, they might be able to create an opening. Everyone gathered at the entrance to see what Vera had found. The piece of hull was wedged in tight, but there was a gap along one side. Not big enough for a person yet, but getting there. Kevin took over the digging with renewed energy. His hands screamed in protest, but he ignored them. He clawed at the packed snow and slowly widened the gap. Inch by inch, handful by handful, while he worked, Hal began recording again. The scientists said they wanted to document this for the Galactic Council. They wanted other species to see what humans were capable of when pushed to their limits. This was important knowledge that needed to be shared. Kevin kept digging. He did not care about the Galactic Council or being documented. He cared about getting these people out of this hole and into the open air. Everything else could wait. After another hour of work, the gap was finally wide enough. Kevin pushed through first to make sure it was safe. The blizzard had stopped and weak sunlight was filtering through the clouds. He took a deep breath of fresh air and felt tears freeze on his cheeks. He turned back and helped the others through one by one. Vera came first. Then Orith. Then Kel. Finally Commander Thizes squeezed through the narrow opening and stood on the frozen surface of the planet. They looked around at the changed landscape. The ship was almost completely buried. Only the top of the hull was visible, sticking out of a massive snowdrift. If they had stayed inside, they would have been crushed or suffocated. Kel made a sound of amazement. They said the human shelter had saved them twice. First from the cold, and then from the collapse of the ship. The simple hole in the snow had been more reliable than advanced. The Lauren technology. Vera pulled out her communicator and checked for signals. The blizzard had cleared enough for transmissions to get through. Her device blinked with an incoming message. A rescue ship had received their original distress call and was on the way. Estimated arrival was 6 hours. Kevin sat down heavily on a chunk of debris. The exhaustion he had been fighting finally caught up with him. His whole body ached. His hands throbbed. His eyes wanted to close. Arth came and sat beside him. The medic examined his damaged hands and clicked their mandibles in the Valoran expression of concern. They said Kevin needed proper medical treatment. These injuries were severe. Kevin managed a tired smile. He told Orth that his hands would heal. The important thing was that everyone was alive. Commander Dyses walked over and looked down at the human who had saved them all. Their dark eyes held a mixture of emotions that Kevin could not quite read. Dyses spoke slowly and carefully, as if choosing each word with great thought. They said that when the Galactic Council first admitted humans, there had been much debate. Many species thought humans were too primitive, too violent, too unpredictable. The Valorans had voted against human membership. Kevin looked up at the commander and waited for them to continue. Dyses said they had been wrong. What they had seen as primitive was actually something else entirely. Humans were not less evolved than other species. They were differently evolved. They had learned things that no other species in the galaxy had needed to learn. How to survive when everything was trying to kill them. How to turn hostile environments into homes. How to never give up even when giving up was the logical choice. Cal joined the conversation and said they had been studying human survival techniques since the crash. The science was sound, but that was not what impressed them most. What impressed them was the willingness to suffer for others. Kevin had damaged his own body to save people from a different species. That was not logical behavior. It was something beyond logic. Kevin shrugged and said it was just what humans did. He did not think of it as special. Any human in his situation would have done the same thing. Vara laughed softly and sat down next to him. She said that was exactly the point. For humans, this was normal. For the rest of the galaxy, it was extraordinary. They sat together in the weak sunlight and waited for rescue. The 5 survivors of the Wanderer. 3 Valorans who had learned that cold could be conquered with knowledge. 2 humans who had proven that their species was worth having in the galactic community. Hours passed. The temperature remained deadly, but the snow shelter was still intact behind them. Kevin thought about rebuilding it and getting everyone back inside. But the Valorans seemed to want to stay in the open despite the cold. They had spent too many hours underground. They needed to see the sky dot, so they huddled together and shared body heat the way humans had done for thousands of years. The Valorans did not fully understand the concept, but they participated anyway. They had learned to trust human instincts on this frozen world. When the rescue ship finally appeared on the Faudoldis, Horizon Kevin felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had made it. Against all odds on a planet that should have killed them, they had survived. He looked at his damaged hands and thought about his grandfather. The old man had been gone for years, but his lessons had lived on. Knowledge passed from generation to generation had saved 5 lives today. That was the human way. The hours passed slowly inside the snow shelter. The portable heater worked hard and the temperature climbed steadily. What had started as -5 degrees Celsius eventually rose to just above freezing. It was still cold by Valoran standards, but it was no longer deadly. Kevin and Vera took turns making trips back to the ship. They brought more blankets and food. They brought medical supplies that Orth used to treat the cracks in the Valorans' exoskeletons. They brought communication equipment and tried to send a distress signal, but the blizzard was too strong. The signal could not break through. During one of these trips, Kevin noticed something concerning. The wind had shifted direction. Snow was piling up against the side of the ship at an alarming rate. Some of the damaged hull sections were groaning under the weight. He mentioned this to Vera, but there was nothing they could do about it. They needed the supplies from the ship, and they could not move it. Inside the shelter, the Valorans had recovered enough to talk and ask questions. Kel was particularly fascinated by everything. The scientists had started recording observations on their personal device. They documented the construction of the shelter. They measured the temperature difference between inside and outside. They asked Kevin to explain every detail of how and why the shelter worked. Kevin found their curiosity refreshing. Most species in the galaxy looked down on humans as primitive newcomers. The Valorans had joined the Galactic Council thousands of years before humans even invented writing. But here was Kel treating human survival knowledge like a genuine scientific discovery worth studying. Commander, Dizes had recovered enough to sit up and participate in conversations. They asked Kevin about his childhood. They wanted to know what it was like growing up on a world where temperatures could drop this low. Kevin thought about it for a moment before answering. He told them it was hard, but also beautiful. Winter in Minnesota meant short days and long nights. It meant ice on the lakes thick enough to drive trucks across. It meant learning to respect nature because nature would kill you if you got careless. But it also meant quiet snowfalls that made the whole world peaceful. It meant gathering around fires with family. It meant hot food that tasted better because you were cold. Aura said they could not imagine finding anything good about such deadly conditions. Their species avoided cold the way humans avoided poison. Kevin smiled and said that was the difference between their people. Humans did not avoid dangerous things. They learned to live with them. Sometimes they even learned to love them. Vera came back from another supply run and reported that the blizzard was getting worse. The ship was almost completely buried now. One more trip might be impossible. She had grabbed everything essential she could carry. They settled in for what would be a long wait. The five of them sat in a rough circle with the heater in the center. The emergency lights cast soft shadows on the snow walls. Outside, the wind howled and screamed, but inside they were protected. Kel asked Kevin to tell them more stories about human survival. They said they wanted to understand how a species from a single world had learned to conquer so many different environments. Kevin told them about the explorers who reached the South Pole of Earth. He described how they dragged sleds across hundreds of kilometers of ice with nothing but their own muscle power. Some of them died, but others made it. He told them about mountain climbers who reached the highest peaks in the galaxy's thinnest air, about sailors who crossed frozen oceans in wooden ships, about ordinary people who survived avalanches and blizzards and being lost in the wilderness for weeks. The Valorans listened in amazement. Arth asked how any of these humans survived such things. What special abilities did they have? Kevin shook his head. He told them humans had no special abilities. They were not particularly strong or fast. They could not see in the dark or hear distant sounds. They got cold and tired and scared, just like anyone else. But they had two things that mattered more than any physical advantage. They had knowledge passed down from those who came before, and they had stubbornness that would not let them quit. Commander Dizes made a clicking sound with their mandibles that Kevin had learned meant thoughtfulness. The commander said that Valorans had always believed technology was the answer to every problem. Build a better machine. Create a smarter system. The idea that simple knowledge and determination could overcome impossible odds was foreign to their thinking. Vera said that was why humans and Valorans made good partners. Humans brought the willingness to get their hands dirty and try crazy ideas. Valorans brought the advanced technology to make those ideas work on a larger scale. Together, they could do things neither species could do alone. The conversation was interrupted by a loud, groaning sound from outside. Everyone went silent and listened. The sound came again. It was metal bending and twisting under tremendous pressure. Kevin's stomach dropped. He knew what that sound meant. The ship. Before anyone could react, there was a massive crash. The ground shook beneath them. Snow fell from the ceiling of the shelter, and the emergency lights flickered. The sound of tearing metal filled the air, and then everything went dark. When the lights came back on, Kevin looked toward the entrance of the shelter. His heart sank. Where there had been a narrow opening, there was now only packed snow and twisted metal. Part of the ship's hull had been torn loose by the wind and thrown directly into their shelter entrance. They were buried. Vera scrambled to the blocked entrance and tried to push through, but it was solid. Snow had packed in around the debris. They were completely sealed in. Orth began to panic. The medic's breathing became rapid and shallow. They said they were trapped. They were going to suffocate. They were going to die in this frozen tomb. Kevin moved to Orth's side and placed his hands on their shoulders. He spoke in a calm, steady voice. He told them to breathe slowly. He told them they had air for now and they had a way to get more. He had planned for this possibility. Snow shelters always needed ventilation. He grabbed the metal rod he had used earlier and began carefully poking a hole through the roof of the shelter. The snow was thick but not impossible to penetrate. After several minutes of careful work, he broke through to the surface. Cold air rushed in, and everyone took deep, grateful breaths. Cal asked how Kevin had known to do that. How did he know a tiny hole would give them enough air? Kevin explained that snow was porous. Air could move through it slowly. But in an enclosed space with 5 people breathing, they needed more than would seep through naturally. The hole would let carbon dioxide escape and fresh air. It was basic survival knowledge. Commander Dizes watched Kevin work with something like wonder in their eyes. They said that on Valora, such a situation would mean certain death. No Valoran would know what to do. But this human had been ready. He had prepared for problems before they happened. Kevin sat back down and caught his breath. He told them that was what survival meant. Hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. His grandfather used to say that the wilderness did not care about your plans. You had to be ready to adapt or you would not last long. Vera had been examining the blocked entrance, while Kevin made the air hole. She reported that the debris was bad but not impossible. If they worked slowly and carefully, they could dig their way out. It would take hours, but they could do it. Kevin nodded and said they should take shifts. 2 people digging while 3 rested. They would need their strength when they finally got free. The work began. Kevin and Vera took the first shift. They dug into the packed snow with their bare hands, since their tools were buried somewhere in the debris. The cold bit at their fingers, but they kept going. Behind them, the 3 Valorans watched and waited. They could not help with the physical labor, but they offered encouragement and kept track of time. Hour after hour, they dug. The pile of removed snow grew inside the shelter, and they had to pack it against the walls to make room. Progress was slow, but it was real. With every handful of snow they moved, they got closer to freedom. Kevin's hands were raw and bleeding by the time he finished his second shift. But he did not complain. He just wrapped them in bandages from the medical kit and prepared to go again when his turn came. This was what humans did. They endured. They refused to quit. And they never stopped fighting to survive. The survey ship Wanderer shook violently as it fell through the atmosphere of the ice planet. Warning lights flashed red across every console. Alarms screamed through the corridors. Lieutenant Vera Shaw gripped the flight controls with both hands and fought to keep the nose up as the frozen world rushed toward them. Behind her in the command section, 3 Valoran crew members held onto their seats with terror in their large black eyes. Commander Dizes, the tallest of them, watched the view screen with disbelief. The planet below was nothing but white. Endless white in every direction. No oceans, no forests. Just ice and snow stretching to every horizon. Kevin Cole stood at the engineering station and tried to reroute power to the failing engines. His fingers moved fast across the controls, but he already knew the truth. The engines were dead. They were going down and nothing could stop it. Vera shouted over her shoulder that everyone needed to brace for impact. She was going to try to put them down on that flat section near the mountain range. It was their best chance. The Wanderer hit the ground hard. The impact threw everyone forward against their restraints. Metal screamed as the ship slid across the frozen surface. Snow and ice sprayed up past the view screen in massive waves. The ship spun twice and then finally stopped with a horrible grinding sound. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the emergency lights flickered on and cast everything in a dim, red glow dot. Kevin pushed himself up from where he had fallen and looked around the command section. Vera was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but she was already checking her console. The 3 Valorans were still strapped in their seats, and they looked shaken but unharmed. "Commander." The Ices clicked their mandibles together in the Valoran expression of distress. They asked if the ship could still fly. Kevin checked his readings and shook his head. He told them the engines were completely destroyed. The power core was cracked and leaking. They were grounded until rescue came. Scientist Kel, the smallest of the Valorans, pulled up the external sensors on their station. Their voice trembled as they reported the conditions outside. The temperature was negative 50 degrees Celsius. Wind speed was 60 kilometers per hour. A massive blizzard was approaching from the north and would reach them in less than 1 hour. Medic. Orth made a sound of pure fear. They said that such temperatures would kill a Valoran in minutes. Their species came from a desert world where the coldest night never dropped below 20 degrees. They had never experienced true cold in their entire lives. Vera wiped the blood from her face and checked the internal systems. She reported that their heating system was damaged in the crash. It was working at maybe 30% capacity. At this rate, the interior temperature would drop to lethal levels for the Valorans within 6 hours. Commander Dizes stood up slowly. Their long insectoid legs were shaking, and Kevin realized it was not just from fear. The cold was already affecting them. The Valorans had thin exoskeletons that provided almost no insulation. They were built for heat, not cold. This frozen world was their worst nightmare. Kevin walked to the main view screen and looked down at the landscape. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds. Snow was already falling, and the wind was picking up. In the distance, he could see the blizzard approaching like a white wall. It was beautiful in a terrible way. It reminded him of home. He had grown up in northern Minnesota, where winters lasted 6 months and temperatures dropped to negative 40 on the coldest nights. His grandfather had taught him how to survive in such conditions, how to build shelters, how to find warmth in a frozen world, how to respect the cold but never fear it. Kevin turned back to the others and told them he had an idea. They would need to trust him completely, and they would need to move fast. Commander Dizes looked at him with confusion. They asked what a single human could possibly do against an entire frozen planet. The Valorans had studied Earth, and they knew humans came from a warm world. Surely this cold was just as deadly to him as it was to them. Kevin almost smiled. He explained that Earth was not a warm world. Earth was every kind of world. Humans had lived in frozen wastelands for thousands of years. His own ancestors had survived winters that made this planet look mild. He knew how to work with the cold instead of against it. Kel asked what he meant by working with the cold. Cold was death. There was no working with death. Kevin told them that was where they were wrong. He said that snow was not just frozen water. Snow was insulation. Snow was protection. Snow could save their lives if they knew how to use it. He was going to build them a shelter outside. A shelter made of snow that would be warmer than this dying ship. Arth laughed, but there was no humor in it. They said the human had lost his mind. Building a shelter from the very thing that was killing them was madness. Vera stepped forward and stood beside Kevin. She told the Valorans that Kevin knew what he was talking about. Humans had been building snow shelters for longer than the Valoran civilization had existed. She had seen it done herself during her years as an Arctic rescue pilot on Earth. It worked. It sounded crazy, but it worked. Commander Theises studied the two humans for a long moment. The ship groaned around them as the wind outside grew stronger. The temperature inside had already dropped 2 degrees since the crash. They were running out of options. Finally, Theises asked Kevin what he needed. Kevin grabbed his cold weather suit from the equipment locker and started putting it on. He told them he needed about 2 hours, and he needed everyone to stay inside and conserve body heat until he returned. He would come back for them when the shelter was ready. Kel asked what would happen if he did not come back. What would happen if the cold took him like it would take all of them? Kevin sealed his suit and pulled on his gloves. He looked at the Valoran scientist and told them simply that he would come back. Humans did not give up. That was not how his species worked. He walked to the airlock and cycled it open. The cold hit him immediately, even through his suit. It was sharp and brutal and familiar. He stepped out into the blizzard and the white swallowed him whole. Inside the ship, the 3 Valarans watched the airlock close behind him. Commander Theises turned to Vira and asked if the human would really survive out there. Vera sat down at her console and began working on boosting the failing heaters. She told them that if any species in the galaxy could survive out there, it was humans. Kevin would find a way. He had to dot outside in the howling wind. Kevin pushed forward through the snow. Each step was a battle. The wind tried to knock him down, and the cold tried to seep through every gap in his suit. But he kept moving. 30 meters from the ship, he found what he was looking for. A massive snowdrift piled against a rock formation. Perfect for what he needed. He pulled out his small shovel and started digging. The work was hard, and the cold was relentless. But with every shovel of snow he moved, he thought about the 3 Valorans inside that dying ship. They were counting on him. They were trusting a human to save them from a frozen world. Kevin dug faster. He would not let them down. Kevin worked without stopping for nearly 2 hours. His arms burned with exhaustion. His fingers had gone numb inside his gloves. The wind screamed around him and tried to push him away from his work. But he refused to quit. The snowdrift was perfect for what he needed. The snow had been packed by the wind over many storms. It was dense and solid. Kevin dug into the side of it and hollowed out a space large enough for 5 people. He shaped the entrance low and narrow so the warm air would stay trapped inside. He carved the floor in 2 levels with a raised platform in the back where they would sleep. Cold air sank and warm air rose. The platform would keep them above the coldest layer. His grandfather had taught him these tricks when Kevin was just a boy. They had built snow shelters together during camping trips in the Minnesota wilderness. The old man had learned from his own father, and his father had learned from the native peoples, who had lived in the frozen north for thousands of years. This knowledge had been passed down through generations. It had saved countless lives. Now it would save 3 aliens who had never known cold before. Kevin smoothed the walls of the shelter and packed them tight. He poked a small ventilation hole in the roof with a stick to let fresh air in without letting too much heat escape. When he was finished, he crawled inside and sat in the darkness for a moment. The wind could not reach him here. The temperature was still cold, but it was nothing compared to the deadly freeze outside. It would work. He crawled back out and started the journey back to the ship. The blizzard had grown worse. Visibility was almost 0. Kevin could barely see his own hands in front of his face. He walked in what he hoped was the right direction and prayed he would not miss the ship entirely. After 10 minutes of struggling through the snow, he saw the dim glow of the emergency lights through the white. Relief flooded through him. He had made it. Inside the ship, things had gotten worse. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. The 3 Valorans were huddled together in the center of the command section. Their exoskeletons had taken on a grayish color, and thin cracks were forming along their joints. The cold was literally breaking them apart. Vera rushed to Kevin when he came through the airlock. She asked if the shelter was ready. She told him the Valorans did not have much time left. Kevin nodded and told everyone to get their emergency gear. They were moving now. Commander Thyses tried to stand, but their legs would not support them. They collapsed back onto the floor and made a sound of frustration and fear. They said they could not walk. The cold had taken their strength. Kevin did not hesitate. He bent down and lifted Commander Thyses in his arms. The Valoran was tall but surprisingly light. Their desert-evolved bodies were built for speed and agility, not strength or mass. Kevin told Vera to help Kel and Orith. They would make the journey together. They stepped out into the blizzard as a group. The cold hit the Valorans like a physical blow. Orith cried out and stumbled. Vera caught them and kept them moving. Kel pressed close to Vera's side and tried to shield themselves from the wind. The 30 meters to the shelter felt like 30 kilometers. Kevin led the way with Thyses in his arms. He shouted directions back to Vera over the howling wind. Left around that rock. Straight ahead now. Watch the ice there. Halfway to the shelter, Orith collapsed completely. The medic fell into the snow and did not move. Kel screamed their name, but Orith did not respond. The cold had shut down their body to preserve their core temperature. It was a survival mechanism, but it would kill them if they stayed exposed. Kevin set Thyses down carefully and ran back to where Orith had fallen. He lifted the unconscious Valoran over his shoulder and carried them the rest of the way. Vera helped Thyses and Kel follow behind. They reached the entrance to the snow shelter. Kevin went in first with Orith, still over his shoulder. He laid the medic down gently on the raised sleeping platform, and then turned back to help the others inside. One by one, they crawled through the narrow entrance. Commander Thyses came last, and they had to be pushed through by Vera, because their limbs had stopped working entirely. Inside the shelter, the 5 crew members of the Wanderer huddled together in the darkness. Kevin pulled out an emergency light and turned it on. The soft glow revealed the smooth white walls of snow surrounding them. Kel looked around with wide eyes. They said they did not understand. They were inside frozen water. They should be colder, not warmer. But they could feel the difference already. The deadly bite of the wind was gone. The temperature was still cold, but it was bearable. Kevin explained it as simply as he could. He told them that snow was full of tiny air pockets. Air did not move heat very well, so the snow acted like a blanket. It trapped their body heat inside the shelter instead of letting it escape into the atmosphere. The more time they spent in here, the warmer it would get. Vera added that the shape of the shelter helped too. The narrow entrance and the raised platform kept the warm air where they needed it. This was ancient human technology. Simple but effective. Commander Thyses lay on the platform next to Orith and listened to the humans explain. Their voice was weak, but they managed to ask a question. They wanted to know how humans had learned to make frozen water into protection. It seemed impossible. Kevin sat down against the wall and let himself rest for the first time in hours. He told them that humans had no choice. Earth had ice ages that lasted thousands of years. His ancestors could not fly away to warmer worlds. They could not burrow underground like some species. They had to learn or they had to die. So they learned. Vara said she needed to go back to the ship for supplies. They needed blankets and food and the portable heater if it still worked. Kevin started to get up, but she pushed him back down. She told him he had done enough. It was her turn now. She crawled out of the shelter and disappeared into the blizzard. Kevin watched her go and felt a strange mix of pride and worry. Humans always took care of each other. That was how they survived. Kel moved closer to Kevin and asked more questions. They wanted to understand everything. How long would the shelter last? How warm could it get? How did humans discover that snow could save lives? Kevin answered each question as best he could. He was tired and cold, but the scientist's curiosity reminded him why this mattered. The Valorans had traveled between stars. They had technology humans could barely understand. But they had never learned what his grandfather had taught him as a child. Knowledge did not always come from laboratories and computers. Sometimes it came from simply refusing to die. Vera returned 20 minutes later with her arms full of supplies. Emergency blankets, food rations, and a portable heater which still worked despite the crash. When she turned on the heater and warm air began flowing into the shelter, the Valorans made sounds of pure relief. Aurath finally stirred and opened their eyes. They looked around in confusion and asked where they were. Kevin told them they were safe. They were inside a shelter made of snow, and they were going to survive. Outside, the blizzard raged on. Inside the Quingy, 5 people from 2 different worlds shared warmth and waited for the storm to pass. The humans had turned the deadliest element on this planet into their salvation. Commander. The Ises looked at Kevin with something new in their dark eyes. It might have been respect. It might have been awe. They said quietly that they had underestimated humans. They would not make that mistake again.